If you clicked on this video, chances are you're quite like me and you want to play old video games. Bad news is, you're probably a zoomer, which basically means that you need to cross a lot of barriers to play these old school video games. Recently, there's one game that has passed this obstacle for me, and that was Silent Hill 2. And yes, I'm saying this not only to sound cool, but also to justify the terabyte of footage that I recorded last month. But anyways, you want to get pussy like me, huh? And play all these old school video games. Well, okay kids, let's do a fun little exercise. On a piece of paper, make a list of the games you've played recently. Here's my list, by the way, if you're somehow interested. Now, look at your papers and circle your most favorite game out of the bunch. Done? Now I want you to picture that game in your head and compare that game with this. My bullets hitting him? I don't think my bullets is hitting him. Now the reason why we did that exercise was to point out how far games have come. Not long ago, good looking games were almost non-existent. Just like Logan Paul's left nutsack. And considering the time it needed for video games to get to this, it's just crazy to think about it. You also might not notice this, but the games you play today will subconsciously affect the way you'll consume future video games. And the more time passes and the Shadow World government start to release all these new technologies they've kept for their master plan, this expectation I call will be really hard to satisfy. This makes it so that old video games that were considered great at one point no longer feel that great for us. Dude, what? Don't be like me, but I bought Deus X because of an H-Bomber guy video. And if you watch that guy, he's really good at convincing you to make bad financial decisions.
Can you believe that?
It also doesn't help that people were already praising Deus Ex as the best game ever in the internet, going as far as to compare it with my favorite game of all time, Dead or Alive Extreme Venus Vacation. Of course, hearing all of that makes me hyped up to play it, but when I sat down on my Fortnite gamer chair, it was the most brain-dulling experience I've ever had. Okay, just chill out to 30-year-olds. Before you get angry, I have to tell you that this game and all old school games in general are only considered great by the majority of people that played them when they first came out. Unlike music, where you could pick any song from the 70s and call it timeless, in video games it's really hard to say that any game's timeless because technology changes. I mean, sure, you can say Mario 64 is timeless, but with music, it always stays the same because it's just notes and melodies. But in video games, it's more than just notes and melodies. There are graphics, technology, boobs, and all that fun stuff. These people who made the verdict when the game came out haven't yet played this or played Extreme Venus Vacation like a mess up. So these people are making their judgments based on these other games that came out around the time Deus X was released. Saying all of this, it doesn't mean that Deus Ex is a shit game, but as modern gamers, this is not what we call the standard these days. And a lot of people might not agree with me, but that's a fact, bitch. If anything, Deus Ex has undoubtedly helped immersive sims get their traction. I mean, if Deus Ex didn't exist, games like Prey and many other cult classics out there like Bioshock wouldn't even fucking exist. Tetris is the highest selling game of all time, yet as you all know, it's just this. You know, some people call this the best game ever. Like, I enjoy Tetris, I love the people who play it, but why would anyone say that shit? One of the quotes I remembered from my late grandfather was, and he also said that you would love something more if you had great memories with it. Like, I remember playing Sims Pets and Sims Castaways when I was 9 years old, and it felt like the best game ever. But what I never realized was that these games are fucking ass. You know that moment when a professor in a movie says something cool like, well, Mr. Bond, you know that a person's subjective experience is their own altered view of objective facts, right? Yeah, this is kinda like what's happening. I still like those old Sims games, by the way, don't get me wrong, but this game is only good for me and no one else. And that's because nostalgia play a big role in that. Being biased will also impact how you have fun with these old school games. And as modern gamers, most of you don't even feel any nostalgia for these old ass games. Oh, what? Holy shit, that's cool. So it really becomes harder to play these games because you simply don't relate to it that much. Now think about this, because I've been exposed to some PS1 style games that are great in itch.io, is it dumb for me to assume that all itch.io games with this PS1 style are great? Well, of course not, you dumb fuck, because at the end of the day, I can say any shit that I want. Matter of fact, remember back in 1930s Germany when people were so gullible on worshipping a certain ideology? Well, that is how much environment matters. If you think about it, country is the biggest factor in the environmental aspect. In my 14 years of browsing the World Wide Web, it's always a surprise for me to see the collective nostalgia the internet has for a particular game. Like, it's actually cool to listen to them talk about Half-Life or Halo or having to be constantly worried about going to school, but I just can't relate to that, you know? And most of you might be oblivious to these sorts of people like myself, because when you think of gamers, you probably think that they also grew up with the same consoles and games as you do. And that's kind of wrong, because what people really mean by gamers only refers to a subset of them from this particular area. For reference, one of the consoles I grew up with was this thing called the PVP, which is basically a Chinese PSP knockoff. Most of you don't even know what a PSP is, let alone a Chinese rip-off of it. That is how much environment matters. Now, I mentioned the environment because it ultimately affects how many games you grew up with. How many games you grew up with will significantly change your experience with these old school games. If you got the short end of the stick like I do, playing these games will be twice as hard because you've never heard anyone ever talk about it. And as a gamer that genuinely wants to try old video games, that kinda sucks. So this is how you get into it, like what I promised. If you want to start your old school journey, you first gotta reduce your expectations. Remind yourself that it'll have no fancy UIs, crunchy combat, or even sex, and it isn't going to be as good as what the boomers say. What I suggest for you to do is to start by playing a game that came from the early 2010s, like New Vegas or Fallout 3. I know I'm naming Bethesda titles, but find a game that came out in 2010. And then if you're okay with that, then you can move on to older games down the pipeline like Metal Gear Solid or Half-Life, or God forbid, Deus X. As with your expectations, the only thing you should expect is boredom. Being bored is natural, and there's not one bit where you don't feel it during your old school playthrough. For what it's worth though, Silent Hill 2 was pretty enjoyable for me, but that is not to say that I didn't feel the occasional boredom and frustration, especially with how awful the controls were. And finally, this is one of the most practical how-tos I'm gonna give to you. To put it simply, you just gotta commit to it, man. Playing games that you don't have fun in is really fucking stupid, but trust me, playing these old school games is an acquired taste. When you power through that boredom and you finally find joy in playing them, people are gonna think you're cool and sophisticated.